Hello, P Street family, and whoever else might be joining us for this lesson. We're going to be, as we've been doing over the last several weeks, continuing our study of the book of Malachi. Again, Malachi was a prophet in that post-exilic period. And what we're finding, I hope, is that a lot of what he had to say to God's people back then is something we still need to hear today. And that is especially true with what we're going to be looking at this evening as it relates to the marriage covenant. You'll notice here that I've subtitled this Desecrating God's Covenant. And we'll see kind of where I got that from in just a second. We're looking at Malachi 10, verses 10 through 16. So far, we've kind of focused mainly on the priests, sort of the religious leadership. And when religious leaders fail to live up to what God has called them to, when they fall short of what's, gravely short of what's required of them, it has a systemic effect. And that's really going to be highlighted in this evening's lesson and some of the lessons going forward. We noted that the priests in Malachi's day had been guilty of dishonoring God's name in two big ways. One, they were performing what I called white crayon worship. It was worthless worship. And they also had been guilty of shirking their responsibility of teaching the Torah to the people. And we saw that both of those lessons certainly have huge implications for us today. And then here Malachi is going to kind of, shift from the priest to the people, the people at large. And here is what I'm calling an accusation of desecration. Notice there's three questions here. They're all rhetorical. These questions are not asked in order to get information. These are questions that are asked to sort of give information with a passion. So notice Malachi says, "Have we not all one Father? Has not one God created us? Why then are we faithless to one another, profaning the covenant of our fathers?" Now in context, the one Father, the one God, the Father that, had the Son Israel, as it were, as that entity. The idea is Israel, not humanity as a whole in this context. The Father of the Israelite people. They were essentially created by God, a special people, chosen people, a special community to God. And that idea of one appears about 4 times in this section of Malachi. It's a key concept. This one God has created one community. And in the cases of the homes, one marriage. And so we're going to see how that was being undermined. That unity was being undermined in Malachi's day. A unity that is rooted in God, the one God that should have been exhibited in Israel was not being exhibited in some of the most fundamental ways. You'll notice here that the third question really gets at it. Why then are we faithless to one another? If we all have this same God, Malachi says, then why are we treating each other like we don't? Where's the unity at? Why are we, in the words of the NRSV, breaking faith with one another? Or the New American Standard has, why are we dealing treacherously with one another? That word faithless occurs 5 times in just these 7 verses. It's, besides the word one, faithless is arguably the most central concept in this context. They were being faithless in their relationship to one another. And it's the only place here in this section, this is the only place where the word faithless occurs in the book of Malachi. Notice profaning the covenant. It means to fail to acknowledge the covenant as holy. It's a strong verb here, profane, that could just as well be rendered desecrate. That's where I got my little subtitle, Desecrating the Covenant. And then we ask the question, well, how exactly were the people in Malachi's day, how were they profaning the covenant? What was going on? What was the problem? Well, there's two things that Malachi is going to highlight in this section. In verses 11 and 12, he's going to focus on the first thing, and then in verses 13 through 16, he's going to focus on the second thing. And I keep saying the first thing, the second thing, because in verse 13, Malachi says, and this second thing you do, which implies the first thing. And what is that first thing? Well, the first thing is religious intermarriage. There's our word again, faithless. Judah has been faithless. An abomination has been committed in Israel and Jerusalem, for Judah has profaned the sanctuary. This is going to be similar to profaning the covenant. Profaned the sanctuary of the Lord, which he loves. And then we go from sort of the general to the specific, and the specific is that they have married the daughter of a foreign god. That was a big deal. If you think about it, the reason that Israel was sent into exile in the first place, Judah was sent into exile in the first place, was because of apostasy. And apostasy took the form of imbibing the religious sort of disposition, teachings, idolatry of the people around them. And one of the ways that those practices, even forbidden practices by God, could kind of infiltrate Israel was when the men, instead of marrying a faithful Israelite, decided to marry outside of that. And they would marry, the text says, a daughter of a foreign god. And there are instances where we have, like I think about Boaz marrying Ruth, a Moabite. But Ruth had forsaken her God, okay? Put God in quotation marks, and became a follower of the one true God, a follower of Yahweh. But there are other cases where this was not what happened. For instance, think of Solomon. Solomon, late in his kingship, I think most of us are aware of his demise. And his demise was directly linked to his marriage of foreign women who brought their practices and their sort of belief system into his kingdom. And an apostasy was the result. So I think, and this prohibition against marrying the daughters of foreign gods goes all the way back to the Torah, back to Moses. God realized if you guys marry folks who do not view me as the one true God, if you marry folks who do not appreciate what you have in me, if you marry folks who are serving quote-unquote gods who are diametrically opposed to me, and you bring them into your home and you start a family with them, it could compromise you. Ultimately, you could apostatize. And we see this all in Israel's history. You know, I mean, God, I think, would have liked to have guarded against this, would have liked his people coming out of the exile not to engage in this, but here they are. They're engaging in it. And Malachi has some pretty strong words about, what that's going to mean. It says, may the Lord cut off from the tents of Jacob any descendant of the man who does this, who brings an offering to the Lord of hosts. And there is this close association there. Here they are bringing an offering to the Lord. Here they are trying to continue to worship and serve the Lord when they are, in fact, compromised. And the second thing we're going to look at adds sort of fuel to the fire on this. But what I want you to see here is the debate about what exactly it means for the Lord to cut off from the tents. Does that mean that he should be killed, stoned or executed, as it were? Or does it mean not execution, but excommunication? Basically being put out of the family of Israel for having, I think the implication here, having been compromised by marrying someone who is characterized by a foreign god. So there's the first thing, okay, that Israel was doing that had resulted in them profaning or desecrating the covenant. And again, one of the stipulations in that covenant had to do with marriage. And here is the second thing. Notice this. The second thing has to do with divorce. And this second thing you do, you cover the Lord's altar with tears, with weeping and groaning, because he no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor from your hand. But you say, why does he not? You can picture the Israelites worshiping, pouring out, and they sense it's like God's deaf. It's like he's not paying attention to us. It's like he's giving us the cold shoulder. And they're asking the question, why is this? Well, Malachi's got an answer for them. Malachi says, because the Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been, there's that key word again, faithless, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. So the people of Israel, of Judah, okay, profane God's covenant by intermarrying with foreign women characterized by foreign gods, and they compounded their sacrilege by flooding the Lord's altar with hypocritical laments, because they were guilty, it seems, of putting away the wife of their youth in order to marry these daughters of foreign gods, or a daughter of a foreign god. And here we see that this weeping and this wailing was achieving nothing, because moral wrong was hindering access to God, and that marriage vows had been broken. For Israel, the marriage was a covenant to which the Lord was witness. And I think the same is true for a Christian understanding of marriage today. It is a covenant that two people enter into, and the Lord is a part of it. He is a witness to it. Broken marriage vows were not solely the concern of the two contracting parties, like it might have been in some other cultures. The husband and the wife were viewed as an entity. There was a oneness there that God acknowledged. And this spiritual dimension is what should have contributed to the stability of home life, the loyalty of each partner to the covenant God. Was a uniting bond which created a lasting companionship between the partners. And to emphasize the husband's offense against their wives, Malachi uses three graphic phrases here to describe the divorced wives, the wives that have been put away. The wife of your youth, your companion, your wife by covenant. Now, one Puritan commentator, he put the matter as sharply, I think, as it should be. Here's what he wrote in response to this passage. He said, "She whom you thus wronged was the companion of those earlier and brighter days, when in the bloom of her young beauty she left her father's house and shared your early struggles and rejoiced in your later success, who walked arm in arm with you along the pilgrimage of life, cheering you in its trials by her gentle ministry. And now, when the bloom of her youth has faded and the friends of her youth have gone, when her father and mother whom she left for you are in the grave, then you cruelly cast her off as a worn-out, worthless thing and insult her holiest affections by putting an idolater and a heathen in her place." Those are some strong words. But perhaps it brings out the passion with which Malachi was presumably writing here. Now, when Malachi uses the word companion, that, I think, takes us back to the one flesh of Genesis 2:24. The word companion means united or joined together. The expression suggests that the wife is not just some property to be discarded at will. She is an equal as a covenant partner. And companion also implies harmony and working together to achieve life's goals while sharing all the hardships and the pains as well, of course, as the joys. I mean, this right here will preach, right? I mean, there's a lot of young couples that need to understand the gravity of marriage, the seriousness of it, the beauty of it, yes, but the seriousness of it as well. We go to verse 15. Verse 15, by the way, is arguably one of the most difficult verses to translate in all of the Old Testament. Here's what we got. The ESV covers over some of the difficulties. Did he not make them one with a portion of the Spirit in their union? And what was the one God seeking? Godly offspring. So guard yourselves in your spirit. Let none of you be faithless to the wife of your youth. One writer says that verse 15 is hopelessly obscure. Baldwin states, another commentator that I've looked at, states that it is impossible to make sense of the Hebrew as it stands. And therefore, each translation, including the early versions, contains an element of interpretation. This, by the way, is the ESV's rendering of Malachi 2 and verse 15. I think the general import is clear, right? That is, husbands should remain true to the wife of their youth, to their first wife, the one they've married. But the details of the argument leading up to that are kind of obscure. Who is he talking about here? Who is in view here? Some four main interpretations are discernible even from the translations. We're just going to focus on the ESV's understanding of it because I think it's the most plausible. So on this view of the passage, the he in verse 15, did he not make them one? That's a reference to God. And the one is the object, meaning the one flesh of Genesis 2:24. So the argument in general terms seems to be that Israel's men should not be divorcing the wife of their youth, and that is improper to sever the bond whereby God has united the two, the man and the woman, and made them one. And then you have here, what was he seeking by this union here? He was seeking godly offspring. Again, Baldwin says, only when both parents remain faithful to their marriage vows can the children be given the security which provides the basis for godly living, at least ideally. The family was intended to be the school in which God's way of life was practiced and learned. And because a divine institution, as it were, is being threatened, Malachi urged that none be faithless. Again, there's our word, to the wife of your youth. We come to verse 16, the last verse, before we just look at a few takeaways. You'll see two different renderings here. You got the ESV there on your left, and you got the New American Standard on your right. And you'll notice I've highlighted here a difference. And because there is some ambiguity on this, the ESV argues that the he is a reference to the man who does not love his wife but divorces her. So in this way, the one who hates is the one who sins away or divorces. For the man who hates and divorces, says the Lord. Or you could argue that he is a reference to God because literally in the Hebrew it's because he hates sending away. And so some have said, well, I think God is the one that's in view here. And so God is the one who hates the act of sending away or divorcing. So the NASB has, for I hate divorce, says the Lord. So I think you see the difference here. Either we have the man who is hating and divorcing, or you have God claiming that he hates divorce. There are good arguments that have been made for both sides of this. I would say whatever rendering we accept, I think it's clear that God is highly displeased with divorce. I would argue that in the ESV it's implicit, in the NASB it is explicit, because it has I hate divorce, if the I here, of course, being the Lord. And notice it says from the ESV, the man who hates and divorces, says the Lord God of Israel, covers his garment with violence. It's like, now I want you to see what's happening here. Malachi is equating divorce with a violent act. Isn't that something to consider? Have you ever pictured divorce that way? But that's what it's saying here. For I hate divorce. The NSB says the Lord, the God of Israel, and him who covers his garment with wrong is how they've got it in the NASB. But I'm tending to side here with the ESV that there is this sort of injustice. There's a social crime that has been committed here, because when you divorce, it fractures the social glue of the divinely ordained marriage covenant. And for the woman, she is deprived of the dignity and the protection that was due to her according to the spousal agreement. And then once again there in the end of verse 16, you see, let me bring this up again. So guard yourselves in your spirit and do not be faithless. There's our word again. Husbands are to pay attention to the stirrings of their heart, whether it be lust or whether it be resentment or perhaps even greed, because in watching and paying attention to these inner stirrings, paying attention to their spirit, husbands can... it will hinder the kinds of feelings and emotions that lead to divorce. So this is it's a loaded passage, and we might say, okay, well, what can we take from it? Before we just look briefly at 3 takeaways, okay, I want to share with you just a nice little summation of this section of Malachi, written by one scholar named Andrew Hill. Here's what he says. Malachi espoused a lofty view of marriage, equating it with a covenant relationship. He passionately preached a message of faithfulness and loyalty to one's marriage partner. Guys, that's undeniable from what we've read. And he warned his audience not to break faith in marriage, because God has made marriage partners one. Since divorce is an act of violence against a marriage partner, God hates divorce and the damage created by fractured marital relationships. The prophet recognized that loyalty to the marriage covenant both fulfilled God's creation mandate for the man-woman relationship and contributed to the stabilization of society. I could not have put that better. I think that adequately summarizes what we just considered from Malachi, which is, for us Christians especially, is just as applicable today as it was for those Israelites in post-exilic Judah. All right? With that, let's just, we could spend all day talking about each one of these, and we're not going to, but I want to get them in front of you, some takeaways that I think will be good for us to just kind of allow these to resonate with us in the 21st century. All right, so here is the first one. It is generally unwise. Some would just say, matter of fact, unwise, for a Christian to marry a non-Christian. And some would argue that it's also unbiblical. I think everybody understands that for a committed Christian to marry a non-Christian will cause. I mean, marriage is hard enough as it is. It can be a difficult thing. It can be a challenge, and you are adding to your challenges. If something that to a Christian should be core to who you are is not shared by your marriage partner, it can have profound effects on how you raise your children. The dynamic of the relationship can be strained at times where maybe one partner's like, why do you have to go to church? Why are you doing this activity? Why are you, who are these people you're always kind of hanging out with? So it can cause some serious challenges to the marriage relationship. It just can. It cannot be denied. It's not to say that there haven't been Christian and non-Christians in marriage who have done well. I mean, we do know in 1 Corinthians 7 that there were evidently unbelievers and believers that were married to one another. And you can think of it like this. So the gospel comes to Corinth, and Paul's preaching, and maybe one of the marriage partners listens to what Paul's saying and goes, I believe that. And then ends up becoming a follower of Jesus, a disciple of Christ, whereas their marriage partner doesn't. And that created a really interesting situation that Paul had to address, and Paul does address it. So there have been Christians married to non-Christians in the past. The question that comes up, though, is, well, can a Christian today choose, if they've already become a Christian prior to being married, can they choose to marry someone who is not a Christian? And there have been some passages brought to bear on this. In 1 Corinthians 7:39, Paul is addressing widows and says, all right, widows, if you're going to remarry, make sure you marry only in the Lord. You have those that are quite set that is certainly a reference to that a widow could only marry a Christian man. And if we're in the case of a widower, yes, marry a Christian woman. Others have said that's not what that phrase means. And so there's debate, even in our brotherhood, on that. Some have looked at 1 Corinthians 9:5. By the way, I'll bring this up. Maybe you can see the little references there. And that's where Paul says, hey, do I not have a right to take along a believing wife like Cephas? Peter evidently had a wife who was a believer. And so the implication, the way this argument works out, if Paul told widows to marry a Christian, and Paul said he had a right to take along a believing wife, then doesn't it stand to reason that those of us that are Christians should only be concerned with marrying Christians and that we should avoid or refrain from marrying non-Christians? That is how the argument often goes, though there isn't a specific prohibition there. A lot of this is what folks are inferring and believe that the text is implying. 2 Corinthians 6:14 through 15 is also brought into the discussion where it is not in the context of a marriage, but there is that general statement made that you are not to be unequally yoked with an unbeliever. And many apply that to the marriage relationship, and that a believer ought not be unequally yoked with a non-believer. But there have been those that have pushed back on that. There are those that have said that you cannot say that a Christian married to a non-Christian is in and of itself sinful for the Christian, because Paul was dealing with folks that were very much in that situation in his discussion in 1 Corinthians 7. So I know I've thrown a lot out at you here relative to this. It is how should we put this, a very polarizing topic. I tell couples that I counsel that if they're looking to get into a marriage relationship, they're looking to get married with someone who at this point in time, does not see eye to eye with them spiritually, religiously, I let them know, not going to be easy. Not going to be easy. And that they need to think through some of the possible challenges and implications of that. And to make sure that they have communicated up front about that reality, or those realities that this kind of marriage is going to create. As to whether I can say unequivocally that it's unbiblical or sinful, I guess I haven't been willing to go that far. That there's just this blanket prohibition to it. There's perhaps more that we could look for here. Obviously, I want to encourage Christians to marry Christians. And again, why are we bringing this up? Because we saw the kind of issues this caused for Israel. Of course, a different time, different context and things, but man, I think there is a lot for eligible bachelors and bachelorettes, Christian bachelors and bachelorettes, to think about, to seriously think about with regard to this issue. Second, marriage should be viewed as a covenant relationship, not a consumer relationship. That's one of my favorite. That's something I got from the book Meaning of Marriage by Tim Keller and his wife. This is so true of so many people today. We have a lot of consumer relationships that exist in our society, right? We have these relationships that last as long as the vendor meets our needs at a cost acceptable to us. If another vendor, delivers better services or the same services at better cost, well, you don't have any obligation. We don't have any obligation to stay in that sort of relationship with the original vendor. And so in consumer relationships, it could be said that the individual's needs are more important than the relationship. But in a covenant, the good of the relationship takes precedent over the immediate needs of the individual. For example, a parent may get little emotionally out of caring for an infant, but there's always been an enormous social stigma attached to any parent who gives up their children because rearing them is too hard or unrewarding or difficult. For most people, the idea is an unthinkable one. Society still considers the parent-child relationship to be a covenantal one, not a consumer relationship. And that consumer model has become so dominant in the West that people kind of go into marriage with that same kind of thinking. They stay connected to their spouses as long as their spouses are meeting their particular needs at an acceptable cost to them. And when they cease to make a profit, that is when the relationship appears, to require more love and affirmation than they are getting back, well, then they cut their losses and they drop the relationship. We have, like Malachi, we have to view marriage as a covenant relationship. It is not. It is not a consumer relationship. And to break faith with your spouse is to break faith with God, to be faithless to your spouse. To deal treacherously with your spouse is to deal treacherously with God. And we come to the third. Divorce is no trivial matter, and we would all do well to share God's estimation of it. The NSB has God explicitly saying, I hate divorce. He is not saying that he hates divorcees, because God doesn't, but he hates divorce. And I would say, if you are a divorcee, or if you know of a divorcee, you just ask him, hey, are you surprised that God hates divorce? Do you think he's got any good reasons for being displeased with divorce? I think most right-thinking divorcees will say, that makes all the sense in the world to me. I know why God hates divorce. I hate it. I can't say that was enjoyable. I don't know of any. I don't know of anybody, unless there's some messed up stuff going on in a person's mind and heart. I don't know of anybody that goes into a marriage saying, "Man, I really hope this crashes and burns. I really hope that this ends up in divorce. That would be so much fun. I would enjoy that so much." No. Divorce is heartbreaking, heart-wrenching. It is so difficult to deal with and to process. There's so much pain that goes along with it, and I don't think anybody should be surprised that God says, "I hate this. This is not what I want for you at all." I think it would be in our best interest to view divorce like he does. It ought not be our first, second, third option. No doubt, as I got some of the passages here, they make it pretty clear that there is a ground, some legitimate grounds on which a person can choose to divorce and then subsequently remarry, and that's when porneia or fornication, adultery, is a part. When a spouse has suffered that level of betrayal, we see Christ himself saying, "Okay, here is certainly an exception." That is something that can be very hard to get past. Not to say you have to divorce your spouse if infidelity has entered into your marriage relationship. But some have chosen to do that, and they feel no shame for that, because Christ certainly sanctions that decision. So there are your three takeaways from a very interesting passage of Scripture there in Malachi chapter 2, verses 10 through 16. Here's kind of where we're going. In the future here, next week, we'll pick up with verse 17. We're calling this Disparaging God's Justice. We noted early that they had an issue with God's love. Now we're going to see they've got an issue with God's justice, a bit of a dispute here. And God, as he likes to do, is going to, put them in their place through Malachi. Hey, if you want to talk some more about this, there's a lot that can be discussed relative to marriage, divorce, remarriage. If there's some of these things that that trouble you, or that you got some questions about and want to work through some of that stuff, feel free to reach out to me. Okay, we'll do what we can. We'll dialogue and work to help you see what God expects and why he expects that. But hey, again, thanks for being here. Thanks for watching.